I was halfway through labeling the mixer channels when Peter Kavanaugh leaned in the doorway and said, "Take what's yours." 7 words. Flat tone. No good morning, no handshake, no eye contact. My name's Daniel Rourke, and at 52 years old, I'd spent nearly 2 decades as senior event technology and logistics manager for Keystone Event Group, the man corporate clients trusted when their multi-million-dollar shows teetered on the edge of disaster. My calm under pressure wasn't a personality trait. It was a professional weapon. If the satellite feed froze mid-broadcast, I patched the signal before the keynote skipped a beat. If the CEO's mic died mid-sentence, I had a fresh one in his hand before his face turned red. 18 years of that, and Peter, my boss, thought take. What's yours meant? I'd grab my coffee mug and framed photo and walk out. What he didn't know was that the things keeping Keystone's biggest events alive didn't belong to Keystone at all. Peter's eyes drifted to the laminated cable diagram propped against the mixer, my diagram printed from my home office edges, still rough from the guillotine trimmer I kept in my garage. Without that sheet, Monday's medical conference wouldn't even get through rehearsal. Out on the main floor, Jordan Price. My right hand for 8 years was coiling cables with the kind of precision you only get from repetition and pride. He caught sight of Peter in the doorway. His eyes narrowed for half a second before he went back to work. But I read it. Jordan didn't need a memo to know what was going down. I set the Sharpie on the console, feeling the low thump of the subwoofer test from Ballroom C. Sure, I told Peter, I'll take what's mine. And what was mine? Pretty much everything that kept Keystone from imploding mid-show. The personal mixer I'd bought after their unit blew a channel during a gala, the custom cable tester with my name etched into the metal, road cases full of gear I'd acquired over decades, each tagged with my own asset codes. Without it, they wouldn't pass a single technical rider for Monday's conference. Without me, their insurance clause would void coverage before the first speaker took the stage. From the hall came the sharp rhythm of Melissa Kane's heels, HR's unofficial warning bell. She appeared behind Peter, holding a beige folder like she was just passing through. Melissa wasn't cruel, but she was efficient. Efficient is worse. She gave me the same polite nod she used when handing out benefits forms or NDA renewals. A few steps away, Rachel Hunt from marketing leaned against the wall, pretending to check her phone, while her eyes flicked between me and Peter. Rachel had a way of soaking up a room's energy without anyone realizing she was listening, which meant by the end of the hour everyone in the office would just happen to know Daniel Rourke had been told to take his things. Peter shifted his weight arms folded. His left hand tapped against his right bicep, his tell, when he was impatient. It's funny I said how much of this operation actually belongs to me. He blinked like he wasn't sure if I was joking. I wasn't. In live events, technical rider clauses are gospel. If a contract says the keynote must be run on a specific console by a certified operator, and I'm the only one with that certification and that console, you can't replace me with an intern and a YouTube tutorial. Some venues won't even power up the stage without my sign-off. And some insurance riders void coverage entirely if the AV crew isn't certified on that exact gear. Those clauses were buried so deep in the fine print that Peter wouldn't have found them if I highlighted them in neon. And that cable tester, without it they'd never spot the hairline wiring fault before the cameras rolled. No fault found means no fix. No fix means no broadcast. Peter had just told me to take all of that. I didn't rush. In corporate America, the person who rushes loses. I looked past him toward Melissa, still lingering folder pressed to her side, like she didn't want to open it in public. Rachel had already ghosted away, probably to craft the first draft of the office gossip. Jordan kept his head down, looping cable into a perfect figure 8, but I knew he was memorizing every word. I'll clear my things after the show, I said. That afternoon's load-in wasn't small, 6 breakout rooms, a live surgical feed from the hospital across the street, and an insurance clause that would collapse the entire event if the AV wasn't run by someone with my credentials. Peter nodded, like this was a gracious concession on his part. Here's the truth I didn't share. When you've spent nearly 2 decades making yourself the hub of every operational dependency, walking away isn't sabotage, it's gravity finally taking hold. I picked up the Sharpie again, finished labeling Dr. M panel above Channel 7, and pictured the Ford Explorer in my driveway sagging under the weight of road cases by the weekend. If you've ever watched someone underestimate you in real time, you know the peculiar mix of insult and satisfaction it brings. Stick around, you'll understand exactly why I did what I did. The laminated cable diagram leaned against the mixer, frayed at the edges, holding years of my handwriting and last-minute fixes. Keystone had no copy. The same binder it would go into held my service records backup, compliance checklists, and vendor agreements. Agreements that gave me first call on the only rental gear that could save Monday's show. In 3 days, they'd see exactly what take. What's yours really meant. Not in a conference room, not in an email, but in front of their biggest client of the year, with a stage going dark and a feed cutting to black. And when Peter called and he would, I'd answer, but it wouldn't be on Keystone's terms. I didn't touch my phone until Peter was out of sight. Then I pulled it from my back pocket, thumbed a message to Jordan under the console. Don't sign anything. He looked up from across the ballroom, nodded once. He didn't need the rest explained. In our world, paper was a trap, especially when it came from Melissa's beige folder. By the time I walked into Ballroom C, the hum of the projectors was already filling the space warm and steady. The client's liaison, Dr. Patel, was reviewing the schedule with one of her assistants. When she spotted me, her whole posture shifted relief. She knew that if I was here, the conference would run. If I wasn't, Monday would be a gamble no insurance adjuster would touch. That's the part Peter never understood. My loyalty was to the show, not the man signing my paychecks. The show had to go on, and for 18 years I'd made sure it did, sometimes by bending policy, sometimes by rewriting it on the fly. As Dr. Patel outlined a last-minute change to the live surgical feed, I pictured Peter trying to explain to her why her clause-mandated certified operator was no longer with the company. I'd seen her stare down hospital boards. Peter wouldn't last 5 minutes. Melissa appeared in the doorway scanning for me. I gave her the universal 1-minute signal, 2 fingers held low, and she hesitated. The fact she didn't walk in told me HR was trying to do this quietly. They were worried about optics. Good. Optics were my favorite weapon. Out in the corridor, Rachel's laugh carried just enough to be heard over the hum of the HVAC. It was the kind of laugh that told me she'd already planted a version of events in the heads of 3 department heads and at least 1 junior VP. In 20 minutes, the whole building would think I'd negotiated a graceful exit, which was fine, for now. Jordan sidled up next to me, voice low. They cut your system access. I didn't even blink. The server access. Everything. Email, asset tracker, the vendor portal. That was the moment the plan started to write itself. Keystone thought their systems held the operation together. They didn't realize my systems were offline proof. My vendor agreements lived in my binder. My technical diagrams lived on my laptop, and my contacts. They didn't answer Keystone's calls, they answered mine. If you've ever had someone take a swing at your life's work, you know there's a second where the hit lands, the air leaves your lungs, and then something else fills the space. For me, it wasn't panic, it was clarity. And tell me, if you were holding all the pieces someone else needed to survive, would you hand them back politely? Or would you make them realize just how much they needed you? Because Peter's mistake wasn't telling me to take what's mine, his mistake was not knowing how much of Keystone was mine. In 3 days he'd learn. I've learned that the most dangerous man in any operation isn't the one who shouts orders. It's the one who keeps the list no one else has seen. Saturday morning, the list was sitting in front of me, bound in black leather pages tabbed in red, yellow, and blue. My binder. The same one Peter had once called redundant paperwork. I traced my finger over the tabs the way some people trace scars. Every one of them had a story. Every one of them was leverage. You ever realize how many years you've spent making sure other people's mistakes never saw daylight? How many fires you've put out before anyone noticed there was smoke? I spent 2 decades doing that for Keystone Event Group. They thought it was loyalty. I thought it was survival. Turns out we were both wrong. I flipped to Monday's client, the Western Surgical Innovations Conference. 48 hours away. 6 breakout rooms, 1 main ballroom, 3 hospitals feeding live surgeries in real time. Every signal running through gear, I owned certified, under my name. The insurance clause was Clear Clause 14. All surgical feed operations must be supervised by a certified event technician with specialized equipment per Exhibit D. I'd written Exhibit D myself, line by line, on a sleepless night in Denver 8 years ago. Keystone didn't own a single piece of that specialized equipment. I did. And as of yesterday, they didn't have the man certified to run it either. The first call I made was to Daryl Meeks, owner of Stage Pro Rentals. Daryl and I went back 15 years, the kind of back where a handshake meant more than a signed contract. "Morning, Dan," he said, already grinning in his voice. Heard you're making an exit. Something like that, I said. Monday's show, they call you. Twice. Some new guy. Todd wanted the switcher the backup router. Told him they're booked. They are booked, I said. By me. That was choke point 1. Without that switcher, they couldn't route a single feed to the ballroom. By noon, choke point 2 was in motion. I sent a polite professional email to the certifying body, requesting a temporary suspension of Keystone's certification pending an equipment review. The review required an in-person inspection of equipment sitting 20 feet from me in my garage. At 2:17 p.m., Jordan texted, "They're asking if you can train someone Sunday." I wrote back, "Sure, double my rate, payable up front." No response. Melissa called that evening. "Daniel." She said each syllable smoothed over like she was sanding down sharp edges. "Just to confirm, you won't be on site Monday. I'll be on site if Keystone engages me as an independent contractor. Otherwise, I'll be home." There was a pause long enough for me to picture her glancing at Peter. "I'll pass that along. And here's where I'll ask you, if someone told you to walk away from your life's work, but you still held every tool they needed to survive, would you gift wrap it back to them, or would you let them feel, minute by minute, what it's like to need you and not have you?" Because Peter's mistake wasn't telling me to take what's mine. His mistake was never realizing how much of Keystone was mine. Sunday morning, I met Jordan at a diner 2 blocks from the warehouse. I slid him a duplicate of the Monday schedule annotated with my own notes, the real notes, where the weak points were, which hospitals tended to lose signal, which breakout rooms' projector lens ran hot after 2 hours and needed a mid-session cool-down. "You're not giving me all of it," he said. "No," I said, sipping my coffee. "But I'm giving you enough. If they try to make you run it without me, you'll last longer than Peter thinks you will. And if they push you out too, you call me first." We both knew it wasn't about friendship anymore. It was about survival. Keystone was a sinking ship, and the crew didn't know yet that the captain had drilled the hole himself. By Sunday night, I'd moved the last of the gear I cared about into the back of my Explorer. The custom switcher went in last, the way you'd carry a sleeping child, careful, deliberate. Without it, the backup router was just a glossy box with blinking lights. Before I shut the garage, I sent Peter one final text. "Per your instruction, I'm taking what's mine. Good luck Monday." When you've spent almost 20 years making yourself the single point of failure in a machine that thinks it's self-sustaining, you don't need to sabotage anything. You just step aside. And when the machine stalls, everyone sees exactly where the power was. In less than 48 hours, Keystone will walk into the most important conference of the quarter without the equipment, the certification, or the operator to run it, and they still don't know it. I pulled into the convention center's loading dock at 7:12 a.m., coffee in hand, watching Keystone's crew swarm like ants without a queen. Forklifts idled, cables coiled on the ground. Someone was pacing with a clipboard, barking into a phone. That someone was Todd, the operations manager Peter hired 3 months ago. He spotted me and froze. "Dan, you here to help?" I stepped out, letting the question hang in the cold air. "I'm here for my own equipment, that's all." Behind him, I saw Jordan lugging a rolling case. He caught my eye and gave the tiniest shake of his head. Their gear situation was worse than I'd guessed. You ever watch a crew try to build a skyscraper without steel? That was this morning. The hospital feeds hadn't even checked in yet. Without the certified switcher, nothing could be routed to the ballroom screens. Clause 14 was already bleeding them. Inside, Rachel Hunt from marketing was trying to calm the client, a sharp-dressed woman from Western Surgical Innovations. "We just had a minor delay," Rachel said, smiling too hard. Her knuckles were white around her tablet. The client wasn't buying it. "We've got 6 live surgeries scheduled today," she said. "If those feeds aren't up by 9, we're not just canceling this contract. We're blacklisting your company from every surgical conference in the tri-state area." I didn't have to say a word. The threat did my work for me. At 7:48, Peter Kavanaugh himself appeared, jacket unbuttoned, tie, loose like he'd run from his car. His eyes went straight to me. "Daniel," he said, trying for authority and landing somewhere closer to desperation. "We need you to help get this moving." I took a slow sip of coffee. "Peter, I told Melissa my terms yesterday. Independent contractor, double rate payable up front." He glanced at Melissa, who'd materialized like a shadow behind him. "We can process it after." "No," I said. "After means I never see it. You know how this works. And here's where I'll put it to you. If someone spends years telling you you're replaceable, then begs you to fix the mess they made, do you cave, or do you let them taste every second of the chaos they thought they could control without you? Melissa tried again. Dan, the client is about to blacklist you. I finished for her, I heard. The room was hot with panic now. Crew members whispered. Someone dropped a case lid. The clang echoed. At 8:03, the first hospital feed checked in. Without the switcher, the signal went nowhere. Todd was shouting at a laptop, clicking frantically. Router's up, he said. Router's useless without the switcher, Jordan muttered. By 8:11, the client's phone was out. Her voice sharp. Cancel the first surgery feed. Tell them it's technical failure. That was choke point 3 perception. The minute the first cancellation hit, whispers started. Vendors in the hallway. Attendees scrolling on their phones. By the time the second feed failed at 8:27, the conference's reputation was bleeding out in real time. Peter pulled me aside. Name your number. Double what I said yesterday, I told him. And written acknowledgement that all Exhibit D equipment is my property. He swallowed hard. Fine. Melissa stepped in, her voice brittle. We'll need the switcher immediately once the agreement's signed. That's not how my process works, I said. Gear leaves my hands when payment clears. At 8:41, the third feed died. Rachel was now avoiding my eyes completely. Todd was hunched over a console, sweat darkening the back of his shirt. By 8:52, I saw what I'd been waiting for. Peter's shoulders slump, his eyes unfocused. The moment he realized this wasn't just a bad morning, this was career damage. I walked to the dock, loaded my switcher case into the back of the Explorer. Peter followed like a man being dragged by invisible chains. You win, he said quietly. This isn't about winning, I told him. It's about remembering who built the foundation you've been standing on. At 9:06, my phone buzzed. Payment cleared. By 9:09, the switcher was wired in. Jordan ran the tests like we'd rehearsed 100 times. By 9:14, the first live feed hit the ballroom screens. Applause rippled. Relief poured through the crew like oxygen. But it was too late. The client's face was set in stone. We'll finish the day, she told Rachel. After that, your account is closed. Peter didn't look at me again. You want to know the truth? Part of me wished the feeds had stayed down, but part of me wanted them running so Peter could sit through 8 hours knowing I'd handed him his only lifeline and still watch the ship sink. By the time the last surgery feed ended, Keystone's biggest client was gone. The conference circuit was talking, and Peter's board wanted answers. And I was about to make sure the only answers they got pointed straight back at him. By Tuesday morning, the Keystone rumor mill was chewing on the surgical conference like it was the only meal in town. I didn't even have to check Slack to know what was spreading. Jordan texted me a screenshot at 8:02. We just got blacklisted from the entire surgical circuit. Posted in the Yanmers event producers channel, tagged urgent. The thing about bad news in our industry, it moves faster than the gear cases. And Keystone's board was made up of people who'd built their fortunes on keeping bad news out of the press. At 9:17, Melissa called. The board wants a meeting, she said. They always do when their fingerprints are on the knife, I said, glancing at the old clipboard propped against my wall. I'd kept it even after my nameplate was scraped off. Some days, it felt like ballast. Today, it felt like ammunition. Daniel, she sighed. Peter's on the ropes. They're bringing in outside counsel. That was my cue. If Peter was bleeding credibility, all I had to do was make sure he didn't stop bleeding. The boardroom at Keystone's HQ always smelled like cold coffee and old leather. This time, it smelled like fear. 5 directors, 1 external consultant, Peter, at the far end of the table. His tie was knotted tight this time, but it didn't help the color in his face. I took a seat in the gallery row, not officially invited, but not told to leave either. Melissa glanced at me, once then looked away. She knew better than to call attention to me. My old engraved keycard sat in my pocket, smooth from years of use. I ran my thumb over it like a coin. The consultant started. We've reviewed the initial incident reports from the Western Surgical Innovations event. She tapped a file. 3 live feeds canceled, 2 others delayed. Client termination effective immediately. Estimated revenue loss $2.4 million annually, plus brand impact. Peter jumped in. We had an equipment ownership dispute. Ownership, one of the directors cut in. Peter, are you saying the gear we rely on for these events doesn't belong to us? His jaw tightened. Some of it was provided through Daniel's vendor network. I raised my hand. Correction, not vendor network. Personal assets documented under Exhibit D of my contract, which Peter attempted to reassign without authorization. The consultant looked at me over her glasses. You're Mr. Rourke. Senior Event Technology and Logistics Manager, or at least I was until certain efficiency measures made that role obsolete. There was a murmur around the table. One director, Susan Meyer, leaned forward. "Peter, did you review the Exhibit D list before making the decision to remove Daniel from the event roster?" "I delegated that to operations," Peter said, which was when I decided to give the blade one more twist. "That delegation landed with Todd, your operations manager. Todd is not certified to handle surgical conference equipment under AVIXA standards. Neither is anyone else currently on your roster except me." The consultant scribbled a note, so the failure was both contractual and compliance-related. Peter's face went 2 shades paler. I could have stopped there, but that's not what you do when you've spent months building your revenge in layers. I should also note I said that Stage Pro Rentals has a standing clause with me personally. Without my approval, they won't lease Keystone the switchers required for live surgical feeds. That's Daryl Meeks's policy. You can call him to confirm. One of the directors actually did. Put him on speaker. Daryl's voice came through low and certain. "If Daniel doesn't sign off, the gear doesn't roll." By the time the call ended, Peter was staring at the table like it might open up and swallow him. The consultant closed her folder. "My recommendation, immediate operational review, suspension of Mr. Kavanaugh, pending outcome and reinstatement of Mr. Rourke in an advisory capacity to ensure compliance is restored." I kept my face neutral. Inside, I was measuring each step of the dependency chain, clicking into place. And somewhere in that click, a flicker of doubt hit me, not about Peter deserving this, but about whether I'd crossed from justice into pure destruction. It didn't last long. The memory of standing in this same room 6 months ago, while Peter called my work easily replicable to my face, burned the hesitation away. As the meeting broke, Susan Meyer caught me by the door. "Daniel, you've been instrumental here. Off the record, are there other vulnerabilities we should know about?" I gave her the kind of smile you save for closing moves. "You might want to check your vendor payment terms for the next quarter. Some of those relationships are more personal than you think." That was enough. Let them chase the threads I'd laid out. Every hour they spent unraveling Peter's mess was another hour his reputation bled out in private calls and side meetings. By 4:15 that afternoon, word had already reached the event producers in Chicago. One text from a friend there, "Heard Peter's finished. That true?" I didn't answer. Some things are better left hanging in the air. If you've ever seen someone undone by their own arrogance, you know the satisfaction isn't loud. It's not applause or champagne. It's the silence after the last domino falls. And if you've been in my shoes in that position, where the person who called you replaceable is now clinging to the seat you could pull away, I'd like to hear it. Drop it in the comments. Tell me your story. The board might have put Peter on ice, but I wasn't done. Keystone's brand was still standing, and I had one last move that would make sure it collapsed publicly this time. By the following Thursday, the Cardiology Summit site had updated its featured exhibitors list. Keystone Event Group was gone, not replaced, just gone. If you knew how that list was curated, you knew it wasn't an accident. Vendor approvals for a summit that size were finalized months in advance and locked under NDA. The only way Keystone vanished was if the organizers got a memo, and they did. I was still in my kitchen when Jordan Price sent me the screenshot. "No good morning, just the link in the note. You'll want to see this." When you've been in this industry long enough, you can almost feel the shift in the air when a reputation takes a hit. Calls stop coming, emails get shorter. People who used to loop you in start telling you they'll circle back. You can't always see the damage, but you can hear it in the silence. Peter Kavanaugh wasn't in the office that day. Melissa Kane told me quietly that he'd taken a personal day, but her tone said sabbatical. HR has a way of packaging an absence, so it's technically true without being honest. The board didn't suspend him. They just left him in a holding pattern far enough away to stop bleeding on the carpet. I walked past Rachel Hunt in marketing, who was pacing outside the conference room. She gave me that quick flicker of an eye look, the one that says, "I know something's happening, but I'm smart enough not to ask." In my office, I sat down with a clipboard, my old trade show floor plan still clipped to it. The edges were soft from years of handling corners bent where I'd thumbed through them under bad lighting in convention halls from Vegas to Boston. I traced the grid lines with my thumb. Then I set it down and reached for the engraved key card I'd kept in the top drawer. Keystone had given it to me after my 10th year, brushed steel logo, etched deep enough you could feel it without looking. It had been a token of trust once. Now it was just proof I'd had access they couldn't revoke. Some trophies don't go on shelves. Before I tossed the clipboard into the shred bin, I took one last look at the floor plan. Booth 117. The cardiology summit space we'd once fought to secure was still open, but it wouldn't be ours. I dropped the clipboard in, shut the lid, and felt something loosen in my chest. You don't have to push every domino. You just make sure the table is level and gravity does the rest. That morning, I let myself think back just for a moment to when I first joined Keystone. I was 29, fresh off a regional AV contract, and still thought working hard for the right people meant you'd get somewhere. My first trade show with them had been a mad scramble, cables coiled in my arms, shouting over forklifts, while Peter, then just an account exec, tried to charm a late shipment through union staff. We'd been on the same side once, and I'd believe that mattered. If you've ever been loyal to a place that wasn't loyal to you, you know how dangerous nostalgia can be. I'm betting some of you have felt that same knot in your gut. Drop a comment if you've been there, because it changes you. By mid-afternoon, I was scanning the vendor list from the Summit's compliance-approved roster. Stage Pro Rentals was on it, of course. Daryl Meeks wasn't answering Peter's calls anymore. I knew because Jordan forwarded me the Slack screenshot from 2 days prior. Peter pinging Daryl with a single line, "We need to talk." No reply, just a silent scene marker. Melissa passed me in the hall, laid her legal pad in hand, eyes tired. "Board's calling an emergency," she said under her breath. "You'll hear more tomorrow." That was HR speak for brace yourself. By then, I'd already started assembling the part that would make sure Keystone's fall didn't just happen quietly in email chains. It was going to be public record, and that meant no one could pretend they didn't see it coming. I didn't expect the sponsorship withdrawal to hit the boardroom like a thunderclap. You could feel the temperature drop when Melissa Kane slid the printed notice across the table. In black and white, one of our anchor sponsors was reassessing its partnership pending compliance clarification. Peter Kavanagh tried to speak, but his voice caught just enough for the rest of the room to smell the blood in the water. I'd seen this before years ago, back when I was just a junior coordinator sitting in the corner of these meetings. Back then, one sponsorship wobble meant everyone in the chain started dialing their personal contacts in a panic, begging for reassurance. I remember one December where I stayed in the office until 2 a.m., burning through coffee just to get a $500,000 holiday gala covered. That was survival mode. Now, this was orchestration. Jordan Price didn't look at me, but I caught the corner of his mouth twitch. He knew exactly how the sponsor had been tipped off and how perfectly timed it was to coincide with the internal audit results leaking to 2 industry blogs. Those blogs had been circling Peter for months, waiting for an angle. Now, they had one gift wrapped. Melissa didn't raise her voice, but her phrasing was surgical. Given the nature of the omissions in our filings, particularly the environmental clause and the NDA date inconsistencies, our partners are entitled to a cautious approach. That's compliance speak for, "We're lucky they haven't pulled every dollar yet." I leaned back, fingers brushing the keycard in my pocket. Funny how a piece of plastic changes its meaning over time. 2 months ago, it was my access to work. Now it was proof that I'd been inside the rooms. Peter thought I couldn't reach both physical and digital. Peter tried a deflection, pointing at Rachel Hunt from marketing. "We need to reassure them, Rachel. Full statement, ASAP." But Rachel's eyes flicked to Melissa before answering. Chain of command had shifted, and Peter wasn't at the top anymore. This is where the doubt crept in, not about the plan, but about the fallout. When you pull a keystone out of a structure, you can't always control which walls collapse. I'd spent weeks tightening the pressure around Peter, but if the wrong department took the hit, people I actually respected could lose their jobs. That thought lingered longer than I wanted it to. Still, the machine was in motion. The internal memo about Peter's indefinite leave was already drafted. The board just needed one more nudge. A second sponsor following the first would do it. And that, ironically, was easier than keeping a sponsor on board. I don't know if you've ever watched someone's power evaporate in real time, but it's not a big explosion. It's oxygen deprivation. Slow, steady, and impossible to reverse. That's what I was watching now, and I have to ask, have you ever been in that moment? The one where you know the scales have tipped, but you're the only one in the room who realizes it. Drop me a line. I'm curious how it felt on your side. The meeting ended without a real decision, which was exactly what I wanted. Every hour Peter was left twisting without a clear directive, the more desperate and mistake-prone he'd become. I let my gaze linger on him as we filed out just long enough for him to register that I wasn't avoiding eye contact anymore. In the hallway, Jordan caught up with me. "You sure about the second call?" he asked quietly. "Positive. It has to happen before Friday." "Because of the quarter close." "Because of the optics," I said. "End a quarter. With uncertainty, you set the tone for the next one." We didn't need to say more. He peeled off toward the elevator, and I headed for my office. Inside, I took the key card out again, setting it on my desk. I'd gotten into the habit of turning it over while thinking through next moves. The back still had the old magnetic stripe obsolete in most of the building, but not in the archive wing. That's where the real treasure was, and Peter didn't even know I'd been back there in weeks. By Thursday morning, the second sponsor had sent their own letter. Different language, same effect. Now, it wasn't just a compliance problem, it was a confidence problem. The board called an emergency session without Peter in the room. By the time he found out, the meeting had been going for 45 minutes. The next 48 hours were going to decide more than Peter's career. They were going to decide whether the entire public narrative landed exactly where I'd been steering it, or whether I'd pushed so far that the blowback took me with it. I'd seen plenty of quiet firings in my 23 years, but none where the room felt like it was waiting for someone to light the fuse. Melissa Kane met me in the hallway outside the boardroom, eyes flicking to the closed double doors. "He's not in there," she said. Linda called an executive session without him. That absence was loud. Inside, Rachel Hunt was already at the far end of the table, a neat stack of manila folders in front of her, like evidence in a trial. She didn't look at me, just nodded once the way you do when you've confirmed the coordinates. "This isn't hearsay," she told the board, her voice low, but cutting through the air. "It's audit trail verified." She slid the first folder across. Copies moved down the line paper, rustling over the hum of the HVAS. The documents were damning altered vendor agreements, compliance reports signed off without inspection, and Slack messages dismissing safety checks like they were optional. Peter Kavanaugh had always thought the rules bent for him. They did until the paper trail bent back. Linda Chen leaned forward. "Every line item here is signed. There's no plausible deniability." Rachel didn't flinch. "That's why I'm here." I stayed quiet, letting the weight settle. If they asked how I got these, I'd tell the truth I didn't. I just knew where to look and who still kept copies that hadn't been purged by IT's quarterly, clean sweeps. The trick with archived contracts is simple. You don't keep them in the cloud. You keep them where the cloud doesn't reach. 2 years ago, before Peter consolidated our vendor systems, I'd had the entire pre-2010 archive scanned to microfilm under the guise of legacy event reference. Nobody cared because nobody thought it mattered. Peter certainly didn't. He'd told me himself last year that anything older than a decade's irrelevant, which is why when those contracts reappeared in my hands, they were a loaded weapon he never saw coming. The final folder was my insurance policy, buried inside renewable energy compliance pledges that tied Keystone Event Group to federal incentives and to penalties if those pledges were falsified. The vendor audits Peter signed off on, they'd been doctored to meet those pledges. That wasn't just internal misconduct. That was fraud with a federal paper trail. I wasn't doing this for the board's sake, or even for my job. My father's name had been dragged through the mud 20 years ago over a compliance scandal he didn't cause. He died with people thinking he'd cut corners he never touched. I'd learned then, quiet damage never gets repaired. The only way to clear a name is to burn the lie in daylight. Linda closed the last folder. "Peter will be recalled to address these," she said finally, but her eyes met mine, and there was something unspoken there, part warning, part invitation. I didn't wait to be dismissed. In the hallway, Jordan Price was leaning against the wall, pretending to check his phone. "Well," he asked. "They'll deliberate," I said. "But I've got the kill switch if they don't pull the trigger." He arched a brow. "The microfilm." "And the originals," I said, "in triplicate. Sometimes you have to pull the plug to save the stage." By Monday, the board would either take the kill shot, or I'd do it for them. And my version was going to be louder. Peter Kavanaugh had never looked small in a boardroom before. That morning he did. He was standing hands braced on the polished walnut table, shoulders tight, eyes flicking from the independent audit summary to the DOE compliance printout. Like maybe if he stared hard enough, the numbers would rearrange themselves into something survivable. They didn't. I'd come in early not because I needed to, but because I wanted to be there when the board members filed in and saw the packets at their seats. Each one was identical audit trail metadata, DOE's own database check vendor statements confirming signature dates. The evidence wasn't mine anymore, it was the company's, and that meant it was impossible for Peter to bury. Rachel Hunt sat across from me, unreadable as always, but I caught the way her thumb tapped against the pen in front of her. The same model Peter had given me years ago when we'd closed a $7 million expo deal in Austin, a Silver Cross pen with a fine point nib. Back then, it was a gesture of respect. Now, it was just another thing he'd weaponized and lost. I had mine in my breast pocket, a quiet reminder of how far we'd both fallen from whatever that moment had meant. Melissa Kane from HR opened with a procedural framing voluntary disclosure to DOE regulators mitigation credit for self-reporting, pending suspension of certain federal contracts if corrective action wasn't immediate. She spoke in that flat, deliberate HR cadence that makes even a firing sound like it's been run through a spell check. Peter tried to pivot to systems error, to vendor miscommunication, even to legacy workflows he claimed I'd left in place. That's when I slid the second packet across to him, a printout of his own Slack messages time-stamped directing the alterations. His face didn't flush. It drained. "Peter," I said, and my voice was steady, "the metadata doesn't care about your workflow." Jordan Price caught my eye from down the table. He didn't smile, but the stillness in his expression told me everything. This was working. The chair of the board, Linda Chen, called for a recess. In the hall, Peter caught up to me. His voice was low urgent. "Daniel, you think this ends with me, but you're about to burn the whole house down. Client, staff, your own reputation." I leaned in just enough that he could see the ledger page folded in my hand. Not the original, my father's ledger stayed locked in my desk at home, but a photocopy of one line. The day his employer had falsified numbers to deny him the pension he had earned after 38 years. The ink was faded, but the handwriting was still firm. His initials next to every entry, like he'd been trying to keep the world honest, one transaction at a time. "My father's house burned a long time ago," I said. "You just built yours out of the same wood." The recess ended with a vote to strip Peter of his signing authority pending legal review. It wasn't termination yet, but it was public. In our industry, that's a bell you can't unring. After the meeting, I didn't go back to my office. I went to the cafe 2 blocks down, ordered black coffee, and opened my laptop. The email draft to Event Pro Weekly was already written, just needed the attachments. I included the audit summary, the vendor confirmations, and a cropped image of Peter's signature from one of the altered contracts. The subject line was Simple Keystone Event Group Compliance Irregularities. Perception is reality in this business. You can survive an audit. You can't survive being the feature story in the trade press everyone reads before deciding who gets the next $1 million contract. I didn't hit send. Not yet. Timing mattered. The DOE's public record update was scheduled for the following Thursday. If the article landed after that, every fact would be verifiable with one quick search. No denials, no spin. Back at my desk, I took the Silver Cross pen from my pocket and set it beside my father's photocopied ledger page. One was a gift that had curdled into a reminder. The other was the reason I was still here, playing a game I should have walked away from months ago. Revenge isn't a victory lap. It's a ledger balancing. Peter had written his entries in arrogance. I was writing mine in ink that would outlast him. The board thought today was the turning point. It wasn't. It was just the setup. There was one last move before this was over, and it was the kind you could only make once in a career. I'd been holding it back, not because I doubted it would work, but because I knew exactly what it would cost. And if you were in my chair staring at the pen, the ledger, and the man who'd made them both necessary, would you pull that trigger? Peter thought he'd weathered the storm. The DOE audit chatter had quieted at least on the surface. He didn't know that the moment I'd caught wind of it weeks ago, I'd gone straight to the one thing Keystone couldn't afford to lose the Summit Series. The series was our crown jewel 3 global product showcases a year funded by a tight circle of corporate sponsors who paid for the prestige of being associated with Keystone's innovation leadership. I knew their contracts by heart because I'd written the original templates 10 years ago, when I still believed in building something that would outlast all of us. And I knew each one had the same landmine clause if material misrepresentation by executive leadership was proven or even credibly alleged, the sponsor could walk immediately. I'd always thought that clause was overkill. Now it was my scalpel. The DOE didn't need to finish their investigation for me to move. All I had to do was assemble the right packet internal memos, the quiet staff resignations, that one board subcommittee note about managing audit exposure, and send it to the sponsors as material risk disclosure. Nothing inflammatory, just the kind of language that makes a legal department sweat. The first reply came in less than 4 hours. It was from Redmont Capital, our title sponsor. Given the current regulatory climate, we are exercising our right to terminate immediately effective upon receipt. Please confirm in writing. Short, surgical. The kind of email that doesn't blink. By day's end, 3 more sponsors had followed. Not one of them called Peter. They all copied Jordan Price, our COO. That was the detail I savored Peter learning his empire was crumbling from someone else's inbox. Jordan didn't gloat, but she didn't shield him either. I heard later that, in the emergency board call that night, she'd repeated one line twice. This isn't about bad press. This is about solvency. For Peter, that was the real death knell. Once the word solvency enters the boardroom, it's no longer a PR problem. It's a survival one. By Friday, the board had scheduled a formal vote. Officially, they were reviewing leadership options in light of sponsor relations. In reality, they were preparing the cleanest language to end Peter's tenure without dragging themselves into court. I didn't watch the vote live. Instead, I sat at my desk with my father's old leather ledger open in front of me, the same one he'd used to track debts owed and debts paid. Beside it lay my pen, the same one Peter had once called a relic when I signed a deal he'd thought was impossible. The difference is that my father didn't have a choice, I said quietly to the empty room. You did, and you chose wrong. The text from Jordan came at 4:17 p.m. It's done, termination effective immediately, no severance. A better ending than I could have written, but not the final one. Because as much as I'd wanted him gone, this was never just about Peter losing his title. It was about showing that someone like him, who thought rules were for other people, could be undone by the very clauses he'd dismissed. And maybe if I'm honest, it was about proving my father right, that the smallest line in a contract could outlast the loudest man in the room. I closed the ledger, clicked the pen shut, and looked at the send button on my final file. Not for the sponsors, not for the board, for someone else entirely. If you were me with the evidence in your hand, the stage set, and one last card to play, would you press send? The file I was about to send wasn't for Keystone's board or any regulator. It was for the one entity that could turn a financial implosion into a legal crucifixion, the State Procurement Integrity Office. Peter had treated our DOE contract like a personal piggy bank, but the real sin was how those practices bled into every state-level deal we touched. I'd been collecting proof for months, inflated invoicing patterns, duplicate vendor entries, consultant payouts routed through shell LLCs. Each one neat time-stamped and paired with the policy clause it violated. I didn't build this alone. 2 floors down in compliance, there was a woman named Riley Chen, who'd been fighting the quiet fight for years. She'd tried going through internal channels. She'd been told more than once, let leadership handle it. Leadership never did. When I walked into her office with my own stack of files, she didn't even ask why she just pulled the blinds and locked the door. This gets out, she'd said, and they'll never work in state procurement again. That was the point. I had embedded one symbolic thread in the file, an internal memo from 3 years ago, where Peter Smug as always had scrawled, "Take what's yours," in the margin of a budget draft. Back then, it was him mocking me over a lost bonus allocation. Now, it was Exhibit A in a case that would make what's yours mean something very different. The moment I hit send, there was no walking it back. The office's system logged submissions with a digital fingerprint and sent a confirmation code, cold, clinical, irreversible. Mine came through at 2:43 p.m., along with the note investigator assigned within 72 hours. I knew it wouldn't take that long. Procurement fraud isn't the kind of allegation that sits in an inbox. Meanwhile, Keystone was already listing. The sponsor exodus had forced an emergency freeze on non-essential spending. Travel budgets gutted, project timelines reassessed. In the bullpen, people whispered over Slack about which contracts might be cut next. I saw my own name pop up in one thread, followed by, "He's too calm." They weren't wrong. Calm is what you are when the endgame is in sight. Jordan stopped by my office that afternoon. She didn't sit. "The board's going to make you interim CEO," she said flatly. "They think you can steady the ship." "They're wrong," I told her. Not because I couldn't, but because I wouldn't. My goal had never been to inherit Peter's chair. Chairs can be pulled out from under you. I wanted something you couldn't revoke the knowledge in every future boardroom that Daniel Rourke was the man who dismantled Keystone from the inside without breaking a single law. There was one more piece to drop. Not for the regulators, not for the board, but for the court of public opinion. A carefully timed leak to a trade journal that lived for stories like this, Anonymous sources leaked contracts, just enough redaction to keep lawyers twitching. I'd had the draft in my private drive for weeks, waiting for the exact moment when publishing it would do the most damage and attract the least blowback to me. That moment was now. I hovered over the schedule button the same way I'd once hovered over a closing contract worth $48 million. Different stakes, same precision. The timestamp I set was 8:00 a.m. Monday, early enough to catch the market open, late enough to ruin every executive's weekend. When I closed my laptop, I caught sight of the pen on my desk, the one Peter had mocked. I thought about my father's ledger about Riley quietly filing her own copy of the evidence about every meeting where Peter had smirked through other people's work. And I thought about something I hadn't let myself dwell on until now, what came after. Because revenge once delivered leaves a vacuum, and I'd built my entire identity around the delivery. The thing I haven't told you yet, the thing that might change how you see all of this, is why I didn't take the CEO role when it was handed to me on a silver platter. That's where this really turns. I scheduled the leak for 8:00 a.m. Monday and slept with the ledger on my nightstand. When the alarm chirped, I made coffee, opened the laptop, and watched the homepage refresh. At 8:01, a clean headline slid above the fold: Keystone Event Group under review for compliance irregularities tied to federal incentives. No adjectives, no spin. The kind of sentence that makes phones vibrate on conference tables. By 8:10, Melissa Kane texted about a board call, and Jordan Price pinged that the summit announcement was canceled. You don't unveil a crown jewel when the glass is already spidering. At 9:02, DOE's portal updated. The altered pledges matched what we disclosed. Mid-morning, the State Procurement Integrity Office sent a receipt, with one extra word expedited. Minutes later, Redmont Capital posted, "We have formally dissolved our sponsorship agreement with Keystone Event Group." One sentence, double-digit damage before lunch. At 10:15, the board pulled me onto the call. Linda Chen walked the sequence: suspend, non-critical spend. Cancel the summit, notify auditors, draft a staffing plan. She never said layoffs, but it lived between the words. When she invited comments, I unmuted. I won't be taking the interim CEO role. Silence. Daniel? The company needs steady hands, she said. It needs accountability, I said, and someone without my fingerprints to do the cleaning. Boards are built for continuity, but continuity wasn't the product anymore. Survival was. I walked to the river. If you've never had your name whispered as the reason a company is imploding, here's the honest part. It doesn't feel like triumph. It feels like standing on a stage after the fire curtain drops and realizing people you respect are still inside. I thought of Rachel Hunt, who printed the packets, Melissa saying hard things in a soft voice, Jordan moving the levers I couldn't reach. By noon, Peter Kavanaugh posted 2 paragraphs of wounded bravado about bad faith actors and a political coup. The replies weren't kind. This industry remembers who signs the checks and who shows up at dawn to tape cables. It wasn't a referendum on me, it was a referendum on him. At 1:30, an unfamiliar number, Mr. Rourke, investigator, Morales State Procurement. We'll be issuing preservation notices this afternoon and need an on-the-record interview. Send the time, I said. Back at the office, I packed a banker's box. Not files, those were already where they needed to be. My mug, a spare headset, the old clipboard with rounded corners, and the key card I'd kept after they deactivated it. I set it on the desk for a beat. It started as access and ended as evidence, like most things in this story. On my way out, Rachel zipped her bag. 2 offers already, she said. Take the one that gives you your weekends back, I told her. She laughed. You're the only one who ever told me that. In the elevator, Jordan caught the door with his foot. For what it's worth, he said, I told the board you were right to say no. You didn't have to. I did, because if they offer me the chair, I'll take it. You should, I said. Just don't mistake a pause for a cure. He gave the half smile he wears when he knows the weight of a decision. I won't. And Daniel, your father, would have liked today. The interview with Morales was methodical, line by line. Dates, approvals, the difference between a control and a sign-off. When he asked why I declined the top job, I told the truth. I never wanted a chair. Chairs can be pulled out from under you. I wanted a standard one that would still be standing when the chairs change. Late afternoon, Linda sent an internal. The audit committee had engaged outside counsel and an independent firm to review sponsor relations and executive approvals. On the walk home, my phone lit up. A venue manager I'd bailed out at 5 a.m. once, and a nonprofit director. We saw what you did. If you ever want to build something that isn't about billables, call me. I starred that one. I didn't know what came next, only that I wanted it smaller and truer than the thing I'd just taken apart. That night, I set the ledger on the table and opened to the last page my father wrote. The lines were straight, the columns clean, every entry initialed. He recorded losses without flinching. That was the lesson. You don't celebrate in a ledger. You account. I took the silver cross pen Peter gave me years ago and wrote a final line beneath my father's last column. Keystone Summit canceled. Sponsors dissolved. CEO removed for cause. Procurement action initiated. Ledger balanced. I clicked the pen closed and slid it into the back of the drawer. The ledger stayed on the table. I won't pretend there wasn't a cost. People I like lost jobs they needed. A brand I helped build may never regain what it spent on denial. And my name will always be tied to the day the lights went out. That's not glory, that's residue. But I can live with residue if the stain it replaced is bigger. What did I actually want? Not a door locking behind a man with a box in his hands. I wanted a public record that outlives all of us, something permanent enough to clear one ledger and warn the next one. Accountability isn't loud, it just lasts. If you've been in a place where someone told you to take what's yours and what they meant was, your silence don't. Document everything. Put your name on your work, and when the time comes, choose the action. You can defend 5 years after the adrenaline fades. We can change how this works one honest story at a time. Share yours below. And if you think we need more talk like this, subscribe. I'll keep telling the truth here. I turned off the lamp. The keycard lay on the clipboard, both finally useless. I picked up the ledger, felt the weight settle in my hands, and let one question hang in the dark. What if I hadn't pressed send?